afternoon, and thank you for joining today's Ask the Experts, where we delve into the topic of cancer and careers. I'm Alana Feuchter, Senior Manager for National Programs with NOCC, and I am delighted to be joined by Rachel Becker, Senior Director of Programs at Cancer and Careers.
Hi there.
I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Rachel. She holds a BA from Rutgers and an MSW from NYU's Silver School of Social Work. She is a member of NASW, AOSW, and a proud recipient of the Zelda Foster Fellowship in Palliative and End of Life Care. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. As a reminder to those who are watching, we will leave time at the end for some questions, although I will ask Rachel some questions to get started. So if there are questions that you have, please put those in the chat box below. And now let's get started. So Rachel, we are obviously living in unprecedented times right now. COVID has impacted nearly every aspect of our lives, including our work environment, as we all are accustomed to Zoom and Facebook and all the other technologies out there. Some survivors may find themselves unexpectedly out of a job during this. And for some, this may be coming at a time when they are close to retirement age. So even if not spurred by COVID, people are constantly exploring new job opportunities. If a survivor is job seeking, what must they disclose to potential employers?
Yeah, so the question of disclosure really is such an important one. It is such a personal decision that people make. There are some people who do decide to share information about their diagnosis settings, whether that's a current job or in a job searching scenario. There are people who make the choice not to for a variety of reasons, because the bottom line is that, generally speaking, it is never required to share information about your medical history with a current or future employer. That said, we hear very often from cancer survivors who are looking for work, who are kind of hold themselves to this higher standard where they feel like if they don't share during a job interview, they're lying or they're withholding information, and that's not a great way to start off a new relationship. And so what we encourage in these situations is to keep in mind that there are all types of information that don't get shared about people in the job interview process. You know, nobody goes in and says, you know, hey, I chew gum all day and I blow bubbles and I pop them really loud and it ends up irritating anybody who happens to be sitting near me. You know, similarly, people have all sorts of medical things in their medical history that they may not disclose. People have, you know, someone might be diabetic, or I think if you think about the number of people in this country who are on antidepressants or who have a history of issues with heart health, and they're not necessarily going into these interviews and sharing that information. But cancer experience ends up being one of these things that changes us so much that we often feel like that's an important thing to share. But I remind people there's no requirement to do so. And in fact, when you're looking for work, the best thing that you can do is to stick to talking about why you're interested in the position, why you're qualified for the position, why you think you'd be a good fit at the company, because you always have a limited amount of time in those conversations. So you want to stick to the things that are really relevant, because that's what the employers are looking for.
Great point. Okay, this is another question. How about, let's say that there's a survivor who's been able to work from home, as a lot of them have been able to since COVID, and are now maybe in a month or two will be asked to return to a physical office. How do you express your concerns if you're not yet comfortable returning to the office and being exposed to potential germs?
Yeah, so this is one that we've been hearing a lot about. Of course, we're now seeing cases go up, and so things are in a constantly moving state in terms of what's open and what's closed. But I think it's important to remember that, again, you know, people are concerned for so many reasons about exposure. People from all industries, all walks of life, and in all levels of employment settings. So it's very possible that an employer who's saying, want everybody to come back to the workplace is also concerned about their potential exposure, but keeping their team healthy as well. And so I think when we have our own concerns, there's sometimes a tendency to kind of get stuck in that anxiety and think, what do I do? How do I talk about this? So the first thing that I would encourage people to remember is that you're not alone. You have very good reason to be concerned. There are so many reasons why you might be concerned besides a cancer history. You know, people with aging parents have concerns about going into workplaces as well. And so we recommend starting from a place of curiosity, right? And reaching out to whether it's your HR department or whether it's your supervisor to say, hey, I have some questions. And you don't necessarily have to tell them why you have questions. You can kind of broadly say, I have some concerns, write down your questions ahead of time, maybe rehearse having that conversation if it's going to give you more confidence having it. And then that first conversation can really be fact-finding. And then depending on how that goes, you can say more about your specific circumstance, ask for potential solutions, or you can just thank the person for having that conversation and go back and regroup and figure out what your next step is going to be about coming up with solutions that are going to work for you. In terms of making sure that you're safe and comfortable, if that's going to be an option. So come from a place of curiosity. Don't feel like you have to have the conversation all at once. And remember that these conversations are happening between so many people on so many levels. It is very likely that you will not be the first person coming to whomever you're speaking to say, I have concerns. Can you tell me more?
Thank you. For those that might be newly diagnosed and wondering how to balance work and treatment, we're going to go a different route now. What considerations should be given? Do you have to notify your employer? We already talked about if you're looking for a job. What if you are already in a job? Do you need to tell your employer? What do you need to share?
Yeah, so similar to when you're looking for work, generally speaking, there's not a requirement to share information about your medical history. And in fact, I've been doing this work for 6 years, and I have encountered many survivors in my time who didn't share for whatever reason, never let anyone in their workplace know that they were going through a cancer experience. Didn't mean they didn't take time off, didn't mean that they didn't take days when they needed to, but they didn't share that specific piece of information because generally speaking, there's no requirement to do so. Now, with that said, people do decide to share information for a variety of different reasons. Some people are sharers. Some people just, they wouldn't feel comfortable not telling the people that they work with. And then there are also circumstances where people might want to disclose in order to access some legal protections in the workplace. And before I start talking about legal information, I do want to say that, as you mentioned earlier, I'm a social worker by training. I'm not an attorney. And so we do always encourage, when it comes to the law, that if somebody has questions, they really want to understand how it may or may not apply to them, that they do reach out to a legal expert. But there is one law that I think it's really important for people who have been newly diagnosed to know about, and that is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's a federal law. Not everyone is going to qualify for it. So again, this is an example of where you might reach out to an attorney to figure out if you do. But for people who do qualify, it protects them against discrimination in the workplace. And it also provides access to reasonable accommodations. And so reasonable accommodations could be a change to the physical workspace where you do your job, or to the schedule by which, during which the hours during which you're working, or working from home is often a reasonable accommodation. Basically, it's a modification that makes it possible to continue working during all or part of your treatment. And when it comes to disclosure, you might have to share some information about what's going on with you medically in order to access those reasonable accommodations. But you don't necessarily have to share everything that's going on with you. So for example, if somebody has neuropathy in their hands from their chemotherapy, they might just say, I have neuropathy in my hands and I'd like an ergonomic keyboard. They don't necessarily say my chemotherapy has given me neuropathy in my hands, and so I'd like an ergonomic keyboard, right? So, so it's going to be, it's, again, as I was saying earlier, disclosure is such a nuanced conversation. There's such personal decisions. We have a number of resources on our website that can help people dig more into that topic. And we're also available for questions. You can always reach out to us, and we're happy to hop on the phone.
What advice might you offer patients who are working while they're in treatment and dealing with side effects?
Dealing with side effects. So the side effects question is always such a big one because it can be such a variety of side effects that people may experience. Side effects can vary in intensity, right? Two people on the same treatment can have very, very different experiences. So I think the first thing when we're thinking about side effects on any level is to talk to your healthcare team, understand, is this normal? Should I be concerned from a medical perspective? What should I be thinking about to help control this? Nausea, for example, people can take nausea medications. And then, this is a moment where you might start thinking about what accommodations might come into play. So again, if there's back pain, can you get a more comfortable chair? I know there are so many of us who are working from home right now because of the moment that we're in, but at some point we're going to be at the other side of this pandemic. And so if going into a workplace would be a concern because of being immunocompromised, can you work from home? Can you take that as an accommodation to doing your job? And then I think the other thing to consider in terms of side effects is for people who may have chosen that they don't in their workplace, that sometimes side effects can share information for you, even if you're not telling the story. So when people start losing weight, if somebody starts losing their hair, that can invite questions from coworkers. And if you've decided that you don't want to share, it can be a good idea to have some kind of prepackaged answers to those questions, right? If you've lost a lot of weight and somebody says, hey, what's going on? You could say, diet and exercise. If, it's really about thinking about the language that's going to work for you and really knowing that, that you don't have to share information that you're not ready to share, that you're not comfortable sharing. It's really just about being prepared in those moments so that you can feel in control of the way that your story is being presented when the moment arises.
If you need to take time off, do you have to use your sick or vacation time?
So this is kind of a tricky question to answer because it's going to vary from job to job in terms of what the requirements are. So I can't really say, yes, you're required to, or no, you're not required to. It's going to be, this is going to be the kind of thing that people are going to want to maybe talk to their HR department about, maybe check their employee portal or an employee handbook that they may have been given to find out what the requirements are. It may be that there's a medical leave policy that's separate from vacation days. There may be a short-term or long-term disability policy that people have access to, or maybe where you live, there are state laws that might allow for time off. But I think it's important also to underscore when we're talking about taking time off is that not everybody wants to, and that's okay. And sometimes we get these societal messages that, that if you're going through cancer treatment, why wouldn't you take time off? Rest, relax. And for some people, working is something that helps them to cope. It helps them to feel normal. It helps them to feel productive. A lot of times we hear people say that it's a distraction, that work is the one place where they don't feel like they're totally immersed in this cancer world and they're actually just themselves. And so, when you're thinking about the taking time off piece of it, if you find yourself saying, I really want to take as little time off as possible, I encourage people to really, own that and think about what their options might be and what solutions might exist to keep working as much as they want to keep
working. Okay. What kind of support can an employee ask for if she isn't able to work at the same level that she was maybe doing before a diagnosis?
So this is a place where this is where reasonable accommodations are going to come into play as well, potentially. And again, this is a challenging one to answer because of because it's going to depend on the kind of job that's being done. For somebody who works in a finance department and does a lot of calculations and spreadsheets, maybe she asks for support with somebody checking her work, after she's done it before it gets finalized and rolled up into that big PowerPoint to make sure that there haven't been any errors made. I'm trying to think of another example off the top of my head. But again, I think that this is a really nuanced thing, and probably the most important point to emphasize is that up to, that people can ask for help, that, that they shouldn't be nervous to ask for help if they need it. Most time employers want to retain valuable employees, and so they're happy to come up with solutions.
So this kind of ties into the last question, and I'm not sure if you'll have more to say, but suggestions for managing chemo brain at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when it comes to managing chemo brain at work, unfortunately, there's not really a magic bullet solution. It's really about going back to the basics and taking things step by step. I think the most important thing to consider when we're thinking about working with chemo brain, whatever that might mean for the individual, is to let go of the idea of multitasking. And that's something that I think has been challenging in all sorts of work settings in all sorts of periods in time. But in this moment in time, I think it's particularly complicated with people who may be working from home and are also trying to take care of their children and run a schoolhouse and make sure, and then the dog is barking over here, and then we're trying to do whatever we're trying to do for our jobs as well. And so as much as it's possible, trying to minimize the places that information is coming from. So turning your cell phone face down on your desk. Maybe it's about telling your team that you're not going to be responding to emails and you're not going to be looking at the instant messaging system for a while if you're using one. So many of us are right now. That you're just going to, for 2 hours, you're just going to focus on this project. And then at the end of those 2 hours, you're going to be back in the game. So, and looking at emails and looking at communications in order to take away that pressure of feeling like you have to jump and respond and have those distractions happening. We encourage people to write things down, not only just like create a record of something to look back on, so there's no pressure to keep it all in your head. It's been shown that when you hold a pen in your hand and you actually write down on paper, you remember things better. That's one of the interesting things about the way our brains and our nervous systems work. So there's a lot to be said for creating a to-do list and then rewriting that to-do list in a prioritized order. And it's also really satisfying to cross things off a to-do list with a pen like that. So writing things down, rehearsing presentations or rehearsing any conversations you might want to have. We talked about if you're going to have a conversation with your employer about your concerns about going back to work, you might practice having that. That can help, again, kind of get it into your head what you want to say, so there's no burden to kind of draw that from memory. And then the other piece of this that is really important and I think probably valuable for all of us in this year that we're having, regardless of whether there's chemo brain in the mix or not, is remembering to take breaks and to work little stress relieving practices into our day. So that might mean having some lavender essential oil or lotion that you can put on and take a deep breath and, try to relax. Maybe it's about walking away for a few minutes and putting in headphones and listening to a song that you really appreciate and taking some deep breaths, because stress can be distracting. Stress can affect our ability to focus and remember. And so as much as we can do to kind of manage that, it can be very beneficial in terms of maintaining focus during when working through treatment and dealing with cognitive challenges.
I love those suggestions, and they are great for survivors, but they're great for caregivers, or as you said, anybody during this time. So
absolutely.
So
caregivers so important. Managing stress.
To my last question, actually, is there anything that caregivers should know about their rights when they are taking care of a loved one?
Yeah. So for caregivers, when you're thinking about legal protections, again, not an attorney, going to speak very broadly, always have to give that disclosure. Eligible caregivers, and again, not every person is eligible for every law. That's just how laws work. But people who are eligible for, caregivers rather, can be eligible for protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of discrimination. So it's written in that they cannot be discriminated against in their place of work for being a caregiver. Under the ADA, they do not have access to reasonable accommodations, though. However, that doesn't mean that someone who's a caregiver couldn't ask for accommodations. oftentimes employers they want their employees to be happy. And so there is, we hear stories about flexibility that isn't legally mandated flexibility happening all the time. So it can't hurt to ask, even if it's not a legal requirement. Also important for caregivers to know about another federal law called the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. The FMLA, I'm going to look at my notes here for a second because I want to get this right. It provides job protected and health insurance protected leave for people who want to take time off to care for a spouse or a parent or a child with a serious medical condition. So not every caregiver obviously is caring for somebody who falls into that category, but under the FMLA, that's one of the requirements. However, there are, in some states now, there are state caregiver laws that may be a little bit different. So it's important wherever you are, not just to be looking at the federal laws, but also to be looking at the state laws. There are state laws that in certain places, they may expand on the protections that are offered in the ADA. They may expand on protections for caregivers from what's offered in the FMLA. So when you're doing your research, federal level and then state level as well, to understand what protections are. And again, really, really encourage people to go to a legal expert to better understand how information specifically applies to them. Anyone has any questions about how to find a legal expert, again, that's something that we can help with at Cancer and Careers.
That's what I was just going to ask you as my last question was.
Absolutely.
People can reach out to Cancer and Careers looking for legal assistance, where to find it.
That's right. We don't offer it directly, but we will.
We would connect people.
Exactly.
We have a number of people watching, and I'm going to see if we have some questions. Here is many community members struggle with the question of when is the right time to take disability, if ever. And it's so individualized. What advice would you give to someone who is trying to make that difficult decision?
Yeah, so I'm going to be perfectly candid because I give a good, accurate answer to this question and say that I am not actually an expert in disability specifically. But I think the fact that, what this person is specifying, that it's such an individualized situation, it's an individualized question. And I think at the end of the day, if the person is considering it, it's worth exploring. And that there's not necessarily a right time or a wrong time. We kind of just need to feel out what feels correct for us. There are a lot of people in the cancer community who are experts in disability, much more so than myself. Again, this is something we can help you find out more and get in touch. But really, really important to speak to somebody who knows what they're doing and really does specialize in this field, we disability is, it's been hours just talking about disability in and of itself.
Here's another question. Recommend that caregivers disclose their situation in an interview process. So we're looking at caregivers, not the survivor. And what about the question of needing some flexibility for travel, if they're asked to travel and they maybe can't, or their ability to work in nights, weekends, etc.
Right. So, again, in terms of disclosure, during a job interview process, which is what this question is, right? This was about specifically when we're interviewing jobs as a caregiver. So again, this is not information, generally speaking, that is required to share for any reason. In an interview process, you do want to think about when you share information, right? So I will never tell anybody, whether they're a survivor, whether they're a caregiver, like absolutely under no circumstances should you ever share this during a job interview. I have spoken to people over the years who have shared these things in a job interview and they have been hired, right? So it's always a call that somebody can make. You do want to feel it out and time it in a way that feels appropriate. So we typically recommend that people don't disclose any information in a cover letter or on their resume, because usually the people who are looking at cover letters and resumes have really big stacks of them, and I was seeing things today that we're starting to see unemployment numbers go up again. So in these more tumultuous moments in history, that tends to be the case. So we don't know what's driving that person to go through the big pile that they have and decide who goes in the yes pile and who goes in the no pile, which is to say it's really hard to prove discrimination at that point in the process. And because there's such limited documents, it's a good idea to keep those focused on what we were talking about earlier, why you're qualified for the job, why you're interested in the company, you know, who you are as a person, all of these things. If you do feel like it's really important for you to disclose, we typically recommend that people wait until after they've had at least one interview so that you've had a chance to demonstrate who you are beyond that flat piece of paper that's your resume or your cover letter. You get to show some of your personality, because fit is so much of a factor when people are thinking about who they're going to hire. And so, you know, if it's really important to do it during the hiring process, you could certainly do it then. It could also be something that gets discussed after you've been made the job offer, right? Because we just talked about how the ADA protects from discrimination for caregivers. If, you know, if they have access to it, again, not everybody is eligible for protections under the law. But again, there's all sorts of information that people don't disclose, things that people don't disclose, and things that people don't know until they actually start a job. You know, we don't know necessarily where our desk is going to be, right? Maybe we're going to be near an open window and the pollen in the springtime is going to make our allergies unbearable. And so we're going to need to move our desks. You know, if there's a heavy travel requirement for the job and you know that that's not something you're going to be able to do, they're probably going to ask you if you can travel, and you should probably say no, because it's not a good idea to lie during a job interview. So maybe a job with a lot of travel, if you know you can't, isn't necessarily the one that you want to take anyway. But yeah, in terms of disclosure, again, it's a personal thing, it's a nuanced thing, and you don't necessarily have to share, and there are all sorts of points along the way where you might.
Well, I think we have answered all of our questions out there. There's a lot of people who've checked in and watched, or are watching us right now. I will give them one more minute if there's anybody else who has a question. But otherwise, I want to thank you so much for your time, Rachel, and your expertise, because I think this is a subject that people don't think about often. You're so focused on the treatment itself and what you need to do for the treatment and every day, you know, day to day. But yes, your job is a part of your day. As you said, some people even find it as a good way to escape the cancer diagnosis. So it looks like we don't have any other questions in.
Well, if any questions do come up after this, you can always, our website is Cancer and Careers at cancerandcareers.org is our website. And email address is cancerandcareers@cew.org. So it's Charlie Echo Waterfall.org at the end there. It's up on the website, and please do feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. We're happy to jump in and provide more information after the fact.
Thank you so much. And everyone have a nice day.
All right. Thanks, guys.